everyone. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. And on behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this evening's program online, as well as those of you who are here with us in person tonight. I would like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and AT&T, and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. Alex Prud'homme has kindly agreed to sign copies of Dinner with the President, Food, Politics, and A History of Breaking Bread at the White House after tonight's program. Our bookstore will be selling copies if you're interested, and for our virtual audience, you will note that you can go to alexprud'homme.com, and you can also get signed copies directly with him. We thank you all for silencing your cell phones. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. And for those in person, when the Q&A begins, we'll invite those of you who are able to the microphones in either aisle to ask your questions. We're grateful to have this opportunity to explore, in Alex Prud'homme's own words, the politics of food and the food of politics with our distinguished guests this evening. And I will now introduce tonight's speakers. I'm so pleased to extend a warm welcome to the Kennedy Library to Alex Prud'homme, a freelance writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and other publications. He is the co-author of Julia Child's memoir, My Life in France, and has authored or co-authored numerous additional books. His newest book is Dinner with the President, Food, Politics, and A History of Breaking Bread at the White House. And I'm so glad to welcome our moderator back to the evening, back to the library this evening. Sheryl Julian is a writer, stylist, and former food editor of the Boston Globe. She trained at the Cordon Bleu schools in London and Paris. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thank you, Alan, and welcome to Boston. Alex, you write that what the president eats matters. It's not just the media reporting soft news on a quiet day. What he eats determines his health and sets an example for the nation. Quote, his messaging about food touches on everything from personal taste to global nutrition, class, gender, money, religion, history, culture, and many other things. Well, no one would argue that it's important what the president eats, but it's also important how the president eats. So we're going to begin with John F. Kennedy for a number of reasons. We're in the Kennedy Library right now, of course. He was a son of Boston, and the White House during his short term seems to have staged the most exciting parties before or since. Leonard Bernstein wrote, the food is marvelous, the wines are delicious, there are cigarettes on the table, people are laughing out loud, telling stories, jokes, enjoying themselves, glad to be there. So tell us about Jackie Kennedy's dinner for Governor Martin of Puerto Rico and their surprise guest.
Well, when we talk about the food of the Kennedy White House, we're not really talking about Jack. Jack had very simple tastes. He loved chowder, hot dogs, ice cream. But when we talk about the food of their White House, we're talking about Jackie. Jackie was a Francophile who intentionally modeled her White House entertaining on Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, who was very smart about using food as a political and diplomatic tool. He used it to broker deals, arrange marriages, and essentially keep his friends close and his enemies closer. And Jackie understood the political value of food. And so when she had these entertainments, they weren't simply dinner parties. They were full of signs and symbols. And she understood that the White House is a unique stage, unlike any other house in the world. I mean, it's the nerve center of the United States government. It's a busy office. It's a functioning home. It's the only residence of a world leader where the public is invited inside, and she called it a symbol of the republic. And so when you had a dinner party there, it meant more than just having a meal. And this is particularly true when it came to state dinners. State dinner is generally the culmination of days or sometimes weeks of diplomatic negotiations with a foreign power. And they can be contentious or they can be friendly, but at the end there is a state dinner to sort of celebrate the conclusion of these talks. And it's a release and a moment for these world leaders to get to know each other as human beings, as three-dimensional people with sometimes quirky tastes, and not simply as stand-ins for their nation that are sort of stick figures. And they're very effective. And as Nancy Reagan would say, you can get a lot of business done at these dinners because there's something about the human interaction over food that appeals to our prehistoric brains. And I actually talked to some academics about this. They've discovered that when we eat together, it's akin to primates grooming each other. It releases endorphins, which are naturally occurring opioids that make us feel good. So there's actually a positive reinforcement for us to be eating in a group together. We really need to do this, it seems, even if we disagree with each other. So I thought that was fascinating. The dinner for Puerto Rico was remarkable because not only was there a delicious dinner, but there was a surprise guest at the end of the evening. And this was an arts dinner, so-called, and there were a lot of musicians there. And so the surprise guest, nobody could figure out who it was, and there was a lot of gossip amongst the musician guests about who it might be. And at the end of the meal, they go into the East Room for the entertainment. The stage is dark, and then a light comes on, and it's Pablo Casals, considered to be the world's greatest cellist, who had last played at the White House for Teddy Roosevelt, which is kind of remarkable. And the crowd went wild, and Leonard Bernstein was there that night. And he had previously been the guest of honor at an Eisenhower State dinner, which was a much drearier affair. This night with the Kennedys was this kind of spectacular evening, capped off by Pablo Casals performing. And I opened my Kennedy chapter talking about this night and what a magical evening it was. And he says it's almost like you're existing in another dimension. It was so spectacular. He'd never seen so many happy artists in one place. And so it was sort of just a wonderful mise en scène that Jackie created very intentionally. And she found that there was great political benefit to this kind of night.
And could create. There's a famous story about the TV personality and author Jacques Pepin turning down the job as a Kennedy chef because he said it's a lot of work with no recognition. And besides, Pepin said he had already been chef to his own president, Charles de Gaulle. Another Frenchman, René Verdun, who was a friend of Pepin's, became the chef. Why didn't the Kennedys find an American chef? Was this a comment on the US in the 1960s, or was it Jackie Kennedy's propensity to be French?
I think it was both. They didn't see an American chef that was of the caliber of the French chefs at that time. And Jackie also had these aspirations to raise the cultural bar at the White House. You may recall that she redecorated the White House and really wanted to make it a cultural hub, which ultimately meant making it the place to see and be seen in Washington. It's like a must-go-to place, which obviously had political benefits. And so the Eisenhowers had some pretty good cooks, but it was sort of meat and potatoes stuff. I mean, actually, Ike was, I think, the best presidential cook. He was raised on a farm. He learned to cook from an illiterate woodsman. He was a very adept cook. And I include his steak recipe at the end of my book. I have 10 recipes, and each one has a little story behind it. But in terms of his White House food, it wasn't anything near the Kennedys. And so she, as part of her reinvention of the White House, sort of physically and spiritually, she hired René Verdon, who was actually Jacques Pepin's roommate in New York. He was a cook at the Carlyle Hotel, and very adept. And one of Joe Kennedy's favorite restaurants was La Caravelle in New York, where the head chef, Roger Fessager, created these wonderful dishes, including a champagne chicken that JFK loved. And he loved it so much that he would order it pre-made, and then he would freeze it and have it reheated on his campaign plane as he was flying across the country. So Verdon trained at La Caravelle and gets all of JFK's favorite dishes down, and then he comes to the White House, and he's on trial at first. He has a couple of weeks where he has to prove himself. He does so. And then the Kennedys hire him, and he starts entertaining in earnest. And they had this remarkable series of dinners, not all state dinners, private dinners, which they had to pay for themselves, official dinners, which the government pays for.
Yes, could you explain who pays for what? Because I think that's, I learned a lot from that.
Yeah, it's odd, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It turns out that for official dinners, the federal government picks up the tab. So for a state dinner, it goes through the State Department. But there are, different avenues. If there's a cabinet meeting, they'll pay for that. But if you have anything that's a personal meal, you, the president, have to pay for that. And this has caused some concern over the years. I remember when the Carters came in, they invited a whole bunch of friends from Georgia to come and stay with them at the White House. And then Rosalind got the bill and said, okay, no more of that. That was, she was a little shocked by the cost. And, people like Harry Truman didn't have a whole lot of money, and it was a real burden. In fact, John Adams, who was a local guy from Quincy, he was a simple Yankee farmer. He wasn't so simple, but he was a Yankee farmer. He was not like Jefferson or Madison, who had these enormous plantations, where their slaves produced
and famously frugal.
And he was famously frugal, and he loved codfish cakes and a tankard of cider, alcoholic cider, every morning, even though he was claimed to be alcohol-free for his health. And he and Abigail were the first residents of the White House. You may recall that George Washington helped to design the White House, but never actually lived there. Adams was the first to live there. And when he arrived in Washington, after a 19-day, very bumpy carriage ride from Philadelphia, which had been the temporary capital, he arrived at the White House, and the building was unfinished. After, I think it was 8 years of work, it was still unfinished. And Washington was a real dusty backwater town. And the so-called grounds of the White House were kind of scrub brush. There were some old abandoned kilns. And then there was a little vegetable garden there, actually, which is interesting echoes today. So now I've completely forgotten what you asked me, but I'm talking about Massachusetts presidents.
Yes. I'm going to ask you something else about Jackie.
Yeah.
She had what's called now soft power.
Yes.
They went to Paris, the couple went to Paris, and Charles de Gaulle was so taken with her and her knowledge of French history that President Kennedy said afterwards, "I'm the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris," and I enjoyed it. They attended a dinner at Versailles that Jackie loved and thought was magical, and came home and decided to make her own magical night. So what was that dinner like?
Yeah, so when they were in Paris, JFK's diplomacy did not go very well because Charles de Gaulle didn't trust the Americans, and he was trying to reassert French power during the Cold War. But Jackie was a complete star. The French loved her, and they loved Jack as well. And so from a cultural perspective, this was a very successful trip. From a political perspective, it didn't go anywhere. But they were feted at the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, outside of Paris. And then after dinner, they were led into the woods where there was this kind of magical theatrical presentation that was all lit by candles. And she came back thinking, wow, that was so stunning. I've got to do something like that. So the question was where to do something like that and for whom. Well, it turned out that the president of Pakistan, General Ayub Khan, was due for a state visit, but only in a few weeks. Generally, a state dinner takes months to prepare, and sometimes, $500,000 to $1 million to underwrite. Jackie wanted to do this very quickly, and she wanted to do it outside of the White House, which had never happened before. So she thought that maybe doing it at Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate, just south of Washington, would make a great spot. And it didn't bother her that there was hardly any electricity, there were no toilets, there were no kitchen facilities. She was determined to make this happen. And so they set up an enormous tent on the lawn. They invited 132 guests. Everybody arrived by flotilla. You remember Jack had been a PT boat captain during the Second World War, so there was a PT boat and a number of other presidential yachts that brought people from Washington down, which is sort of a great way to get to Mount Vernon. Then the limousines drove people up the bluff to Mount Vernon. Everybody except for Robert Kennedy, who insisted on hiking up himself. It was one of those great summer evenings. The light was fading into kind of pastel colors. The ladies' jewelry was flickering in the candlelight. A cloud of fireflies came out and added this kind of surreal cloud of color and light. Chef Verdun had made a poulet chasseur, which is a chicken with mushroom dish, which was reheated there at Mount Vernon. Right before the dinner, there was some stress. They had put the portable toilets in a patch of poison ivy, which they had to move. Then the mosquitoes came out and started feasting on all the workmen, having their own state dinner. And so they sprayed them with insecticide, which then wafted over towards the cooking, and Verdun almost quit on the spot and returned to France. But in these conditions, Jackie had this kind of zen, a steely zen, I would call it. She would say, well, of course it can be done. And it was. And so the dinner was prepared, the guests were getting ready, and just before the dinner started, Kennedy took General Khan for a walk in Washington's garden, just the two of them alone. Now, the backstory to this is, as with all state dinners, there's an economic and diplomatic subtext going on behind the scenes. This was in July, and in April, we'd had the we'd had the Bay of Pigs fiasco. So Jack was feeling a little tender about his foreign relations. And it turned out that Pakistan was furious with America because Jack had given India, Pakistan's mortal enemy, $1 billion in aid and hadn't bothered to tell General Khan about this. And he was furious. And so he had cut off the CIA's use of secret air bases in Pakistan. And so part of the deal for this dinner was that Kennedy wanted to get the use of those air bases back. And so when he and Khan walked through the garden that night, he must have been incredibly charming. Nobody knows what he said. And most of the guests had no idea this was going on behind the scenes. Because, sure enough, between Jack's charm and Jackie's beautiful, magical evening, Khan was completely charmed and allowed the CIA to once again fly out of his air bases to spy on China's nuclear program and to drop insurgents into Tibet. And so I love this story because it encapsulates what a state dinner can be. It's got drama, it's got wonderful food, it's got this beautiful mise en scène, and then there's this Cold War intrigue going on behind the scenes. And it all paid off because Kennedy and Khan bonded that night personally as two humans. And then a year later, China invaded India and almost caused a crisis there. And in fact, it happened right when we were in the midst of dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we don't know about that conflict so much in this country, but it was very important. And it laid the ground for the tensions that still exist in that region today. Anyway, so this is just a fabulous dinner that kind of sums up what a state dinner can be.
We're going to jump ahead to the Clintons. When they went to the White House, a London newspaper, The Independent, wrote, "Maybe the Clintons will at last define what U.S. cuisine is, or which American cooking is most American. That would be no mean achievement." So, did they do that?
Yes, to a certain extent they did. But to give you the backstory to that, what we now think of as American cuisine really began, I think, around the era of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, as you probably know, was a natural epicure who really understood gastrodiplomacy, the use of food as a political tool. He was the ambassador to France, and with him he brought his slave chef, James Hemings, brother of Sally Hemings. And James was trained at some of Paris's finest kitchens, and so he essentially became a three-star chef. He was young. He was very smart. He became almost fluent in French. He could speak French better than Jefferson. He was literate. He could read and write, which was very unusual for a slave. And because slavery was not legal at the time in France, he was getting paid pretty handsomely. He's getting paid the equivalent of what a white cook would be paid. And so he pocketed quite a bit of money. And when they came back to the States, he cooked some remarkable meals. And he and Jefferson were an amazing team. Jefferson had this vision for what American food could be, informed by his time in Europe. And James Hemings had the skill to make it happen. And so they created a fusion cuisine, which combined indigenous American ingredients like corn and venison and cod with French technique, largely British recipes, African herbs and spices, and some of his own, intuitive cooking. And it created this cookery that became known as Virginia cuisine, which was really Jefferson and Hemings cuisine, which informed American cooking and still does today. And when the Clintons came in, you may recall that Bill had a weak heart, and Hillary was concerned about creating a healthier diet. And so she worked with the chef, Walter Scheib, to create a healthy diet. And he was known as a fusion cook. He would take Latin or Asian elements and incorporate them into his kind of Western style food. And so this notion of American cuisine as a fusion cuisine was expanded when the Clintons came in. And he really, Walter Scheib, the chef, really pushed the envelope, and Hillary was a willing student. She would pepper him with questions. What is rutabaga and how do you use it? And how many calories are in that dish? And what can we do to spice things up? She liked spice. And he loved it. He loved the challenge of working with her. And then when the Bushes came in, George W. Bush, they had plainer tastes. They were Texans. He liked nachos. He liked grilled cheese for lunch. He liked a steak for dinner. Laura Bush had what Walter Scheib called country club cuisine, sort of basics. And Scheib found himself getting kind of bored by that because he loved the give and take with the Clintons.
He meant it as a
And he
insult.
really missed it. And there was tension, and he ultimately was pushed out. And instead of doing what you're supposed to do, which is to say, oh, well, I'm moving on to other opportunities, spend some more time with my family, he went to the New York Times and he said, they kicked me out and I'm, and it blew up in his face, not surprisingly. And, he ended up being fine, but he had a sort of a tragic ending. And one of the things that's interesting is that some of the cooks who work at the White House have personalities that are as dramatic as the presidents and first ladies. And so Walter Scheib is one of those.
So another state dinner I want you to tell us about is the time Boris Yeltsin visited the Clinton White House in a meeting that was called the Bill and Boris Show.
Right. With the Bill and Boris Show...
Excuse me for a minute. Be sure to tell us what happened the next day as well.
Okay. Well, as you remember, Yeltsin was a big roly-poly guy who liked to have a few drinks. And Bill was a big and roly-poly guy, and they were called the Two Bears. And they had similar tastes. And, I mean, Bill wasn't a big drinker at all, but Yeltsin was. And so the night of the state dinner, the State Department was concerned that Yeltsin might drink a little too much. And so they served vodka, but they cut his with water. Somehow he got around that, and he was imbibing. And at the end of the dinner, there was an American orchestra that played a suite of Russian songs, and Yeltsin launched out of his table and began to conduct them dramatically. And so, you know, the State Department people kind of gently brought him back to his table, and then they got through the dinner, and they're, okay, phew, we got that done. And they take him back to Blair House, which is the guest house for presidential guests. And everything was calm until about 2 in the morning when they discovered Boris Yeltsin walking around the streets of Washington dressed only in his underwear in search of pizza, completely inebriated. And much to their horrors, the Secret Service was able to corral him and get him back. They got him a pizza, and they took him back to Blair House and calmed him down. So there was a series of meetings the next day, and then a quieter dinner. And then that night, he somehow got out of his room at Blair House and snuck down the back stairs, whereupon the Russian Secret Service and the American Secret Service converged on him in the dark, which could have led to a shootout, with a drunk Yeltsin bouncing around in between them. And they managed to get him back up to his room and lock the door this time. And that was, you know, it was interesting because it's funny, but it's also sad. He was an alcoholic, and he essentially ended up drinking himself to death. But also, it inspired people like Vladimir Putin to take a harder stance. Putin was embarrassed by these shenanigans and felt that people like Gorbachev and Yeltsin had portrayed Russia as a weak and ineffective state. And so he was driven by this vision of a strong, macho Russia, and we've seen the results now.
So we're going to go back to the early presidencies. When Washington stepped into the office as the first president, there really had never been anything quite like that role. He was elected, he wasn't royalty, and the world was watching. He must have been very conscious that he was setting a precedent. So he brought a man up from Mount Vernon named Hercules, an enslaved man, who was his cook at Mount Vernon. And tell us a little bit about Hercules, and also about his side hustle with the extra food in the kitchen.
Hercules, as someone should make a movie about this guy. He's remarkable. His full name was Hercules Posey. He was a slave at Mount Vernon, and he was trained as a cook. And in those days, you had to cook over open fire, which is very difficult to do. And you had to be very skilled. You had to know how to bank the coals over here, but make them burn brightly over there. Everything was, you had to start early in the morning to get the fire just the right temperature. It was a high-intensity job. And had he been around now, he probably would have had his own cooking show. According to the contemporary accounts that I found, he was a real perfectionist. He wanted the food to look just right and taste just right, and the plates had to be clean, and the kitchen had to be spotless, and woe betide anybody who got that wrong. He would let them have it. And he was sort of this mercurial, egotistical, crazed cooking genius, you know. And the Washingtons relied on him. I mean, really, so much happened over meals in those days, and still does. And so the reputation of the Washingtons and the nation rested in Hercules' very skilled hands. And they acknowledged this by giving him a little extra rations, and then they allowed, as Sheryl just said, allowed him to sell leftovers in the markets to make some money. And he was a bit of a dandy, and so he bought a top hat. He wore very fine clothes. He famously had a cane with a gold handle on it, and he would walk through the streets of Philadelphia, through the open air markets, food markets, on display. And as you can imagine, a guy like this did not love being a slave. And so he began to quietly plot his escape. And Washington became suspicious when Hercules asked for his son to be moved from Mount Vernon to Philadelphia to help him in the kitchen. And Washington suspected that they were up to something. And he was probably right. But then he did a very underhanded thing. Our great first leader put Hercules back at Mount Vernon because there was a law that if you were in Philadelphia, which was an abolitionist hotbed at that point, longer than 3 months, they could apply for their freedom. And so right before the 3-month mark, he would send Hercules back to Mount Vernon. And then, as he was getting ready to retire, he put Hercules to work, not in the kitchen, but in the fields. And, for a guy who liked his fine clothes and his nice soft hands, this was considered a real affront. And so the night of Washington's 65th birthday, which was right when he was resigning his second term, Hercules disappeared into the night and was never found. It's an amazing story. They think he probably either ended up with a New England family cooking for somebody who really appreciated his skills, or he even might have gone to Europe. He was seen once in New York. Martha Washington, in particular, was furious because she relied on him so much for her entertaining, and it took her a long time to find a new cook to replace him. And they actually sent slave catchers out to try to find Hercules, but they couldn't find him. He was too tricky. And so it's just an amazing story, and there are many like that in the early days.
Good for Hercules.
Yeah.
I want you to talk a little bit about entertaining. There was a horseshoe table for a very long time. Then there became, they turned into ovals and rounds, and there was a particular way to seat the guests. Jefferson liked what he called a pell-mell system, where guests sat where they liked, which probably horrified them. So how did all that work? I'm sure today it's very, very organized and programmed, but how did it work back then?
Yeah, the Jefferson thing is interesting. Like the Knights of the Round Table, who all sat at a round table so that there was no power seat, everybody was equal, he would seat his guests at an oval or round table because he felt that demonstrated a more American equality. And he was one of the first people to really pay attention to creating an American set of manners and etiquette and protocol. And each of those things is a separate sort of field of study. And we had, in the early days during Washington, we relied on the British system, but Jefferson felt that wasn't quite right. And he really worked to create a new set of rules by which to live. And people think that things like manners are very trivial, but actually they're super important because it gives us a framework in which to live and to have different kinds of people get along with an agreed upon set of rules, which are sometimes arbitrary, but they help people communicate. And in those days, you had people from all over the world coming who spoke different languages, had different customs. You had people from the frontier coming into Washington, some of whom didn't even know how to use a fork. They used to eat with their fingers, and they would spit on the ground, and they would toss their chicken bones. And so Jefferson was trying to get them all to kind of have a set of social rules what they could agree on. And so this notion of etiquette and seating became more and more important as Americans learned how to socialize in a political context. The horseshoe table that you mentioned was a long-standing tradition. I think it began with the U.S. Grants administration. And I know that the Eisenhowers used it. Jackie Kennedy didn't like that. Her innovation was to seat people not at a giant U-shaped table, which she felt was awkward, but at smaller, rounder tables, where not only could she sit more people that way, but it involved people with intimate conversation. And she was very much about human communication. She also, instead of having giant vases of roses and things where it blocked people's view, she had much lower flowers that were based on old Flemish paintings, actually. So she really thought through the sort of theatrics of dining, understanding that the White House is a stage or a stage set on which you're dining. And so today, we really use the Jackie Kennedy model still. And when you see the seating arrangements for a state dinner, it's very carefully worked out about who sits next to who. You don't want an industrialist sitting next to a fiery union boss, or two politicians who hate each other. And so it's very carefully worked out, and it's very important.
Your chapter on Lincoln was heartbreaking. The toll his presidency and the Civil War took on him. You can practically feel his exhaustion. But before that, after his inauguration, when he and Mrs. Lincoln had a big reception at the White House, the guests vandalized the place. They tore the draperies, they cut lace out of curtains, and then at a second party, they walked off with whole legs of lamb off the tables and smashed glasses. What was going on?
Well, America was in turmoil. That's what was going on, and the public seemed to pick up on this chaotic energy. The second one you mentioned was his second inauguration in 1865, right near the end of the Civil War. It was clear that the Union was going to win, and his second inauguration came along, and he wanted to have a big celebration. The Lincolns had just lost their son, Willie, who had died of, I think it was smallpox. And so Mary Todd Lincoln was heartbroken, and yet they were trying to put on a good face because here they were victorious at the end of the Civil War, and they wanted to bring everybody together. And they held this celebratory dinner at the Treasury Building, which is a big, beautiful building in Washington. And it started off really well. It was a beautiful evening. The guests showed up. Drinks were served. The band was playing. People started to dance. But then the usher who had locked the dining room doors lost the key, and they couldn't get in for dinner. And so they drank and danced some more, and the energy started to pick up. Finally, they found the key. They opened the doors, and the crowd was now famished, and they saw this magical sight when they walked in, which was table after table laden with this beautifully prepared food, just fantastic. They'd imported a chef from New York and a pastry chef who made these spectacular cakes. And this was a real celebration, not only of Lincoln's second inaugural, but also the end of the Civil War. But by this point, the crowd was fired up, shall we say. And they attacked the food. And literally, as Sheryl was saying, they're carrying off legs of lamb, they're smashing glasses, they're ripping down the drapery, there's cake ground into the rugs. And the poor Lincolns are sitting on this dais, kind of watching this, not knowing really what to do. His Secret Service guy said, in retrospect, that the public sensed the end of the war and also the end of Lincoln. They sensed that Lincoln was somehow going to soon disappear from the scene, and sure enough, he was assassinated not long after that night. And it was really this almost physical manifestation of the sort of spiritual turmoil that the nation was in at that point. And of course, it turned into a food fight.
Heartbreaking. Tell us what happened when the Maine congressional delegation sent a whole wild North Atlantic salmon to President Hoover at the White House, and the kitchen got a hold of it.
So the story here is that for years, people would send food as gifts to the White House. Most notoriously, a couple of times, they would send a giant cheese, 250-pound cheese. Andrew Jackson had one of these cheeses, and he let the public into the White House to eat it. And similar to Lincoln's party, they not only attacked the cheese, they attacked the White House and ground the cheese into the rugs and ripped down curtains. And the White House had to be fumigated because it all smelled of rotting cheese after that. On a more positive note, there was a tradition of the presidential salmon, so-called, which was sent from Maine every year. The first salmon caught, the first Atlantic salmon caught, would be sent to the president as a tribute. And this tradition went on for over 100 years. Now, Herbert Hoover was actually quite a gourmet, and he was a fisherman. He liked to go trout fishing. And so the Mainers sent him their first salmon of the year. It was a beautiful fish. And Hoover was an engineer, so he ran his White House in a very precise way. So the kitchen receives the salmon, they gut it, behead it, put the salmon in the fridge, getting it ready for dinner that night. Whereupon the senator from Maine shows up and wants a photograph of the president with the salmon for the folks back home. So the kitchen quickly fished the head out of the garbage, sewed it back onto the salmon carcass. The president posed with the senator from Maine, and everybody was happy.
FDR famously served hot dogs to the late Queen Elizabeth's father, King George VI, and her mother Elizabeth. And to the president's delight, the king asked for another, all washed down with beer. But FDR had a discerning palate that his wife, Eleanor, and her housekeeper, I guess she was, Henrietta Nesbit, insisted on ignoring. Mrs. Nesbit was a real thorn in FDR's side. They kept her for years and years. Why? What was going on there? The food at the White House apparently was so bad, you write, that Hemingway's wife bought a bunch of sandwiches at Union Station on her way to the White House.
That's right, yeah.
So she would have something to eat.
Yeah. Well, FDR was a real epicure. He grew up in great luxury in Hyde Park, New York. He loved to have things like bison tongue, special shrimp flown in, obscure snails and duck. He loved these kinds of things. They kind of ignited his senses. And Eleanor had much plainer tastes. She liked a dry piece of whole wheat toast for breakfast, almond soup for lunch, and kedgeree, which is basically eggs scrambled with rice and fish for dinner. And she fully admitted that she saw food as fuel. And she kind of resented being First Lady, but she understood the value of the bully pulpit. And so she used food as a way to set an example for the nation during the Second World War. She lectured on the value of victory gardens, eating economically, female empowerment in the kitchen, where women were trained to think scientifically about nutrition and the caloric value of food. And so she really used the food in a different way from her husband. And one of the things that she did is she hired Mrs. Nesbit as the housekeeper. Mrs. Nesbit was down on her luck, and Eleanor thought it would be a good thing to hire her. She liked the bread that Mrs. Nesbit made. The problem is that Mrs. Nesbit had absolutely no clue about food other than baking, and had never cooked or never worked at a place like the White House where you're under a spotlight every day, cooking for very important people. And she didn't do the cooking. She was in charge of the White House kitchen, and she did the procurement, and she came up with the menus. And her idea was to have simple foods simply prepared, which was an understatement. She believed in serving leftovers, the cheaper cuts of meat, vegetables should be canned, salads should be made out of Jell-O with marshmallows or candy canes, things like that. And then she would get into these repetitive ruts. So she would serve FDR oatmeal breakfast for every day for a month, at which point he would explode. Here's this great gourmet, and he would say, "Doesn't Mrs. Nesbitt know there's any other breakfast cereal?" And he'd rip out ads from newspapers and give them to her for Kellogg's cornflakes or whatever it was. And then she'd serve him liver and beans 6 nights in a row, or I forget what it was, chicken livers 6 nights in a row, and he just couldn't stand this. And yet he seemed powerless to control his own diet. And this is the most powerful man in the world, and it begs the question, what was going on here? Well, it helps to understand that Eleanor had discovered that FDR was having an affair with her social secretary, Lucy Mercer. And this was a real betrayal. And she was mortally wounded by this. And they actually discussed getting divorced. And they agreed that they would get divorced. But his political advisors warned that this would ruin his presidency, and his mother, the very powerful Sarah Roosevelt, said that she would disinherit him. And so between the family pressure and the political pressure, they decided to stay married. But it became what Eleanor called an armed truce after that. She said, "I have the memory of an elephant. I can forgive, but I never forget." And so they had this tense standoff. And so one theory is that Henrietta Nesbitt was a tool of domestic revenge.
It worked.
It worked.
LBJ brought his black cook, Zephyr Wright?
Zephyr Wright.
Zephyr Wright from Texas when he went to Washington as a congressman. And she and her husband, Sammy, drove back and forth between Washington and Texas. And in 1948, when he was a senator, he wanted her to drive back to Texas for a special celebration he was having, and she refused. What did she tell him? And follow it with what he did for her many years later.
She told the president that she would not make another drive from Washington to Texas because she and Sammy were treated so badly during those days. They couldn't use the restrooms, they couldn't stay in hotels, they couldn't eat in restaurants because of the color of their skin. And she said, "We're not going to do it anymore, we refuse. We have to sleep in the car at night. I have to go to the bathroom in the bushes. This is just inhuman, and I refuse to do it." And LBJ, who, according to Robert Caro, worked diligently against civil rights for many years, didn't respond, and she didn't quite know how to take this. But she was somebody who was very important to the Johnson household. She was a wonderful cook. She specialized in chili and ribs, two of his favorite dishes. He used his Stonewall Ranch as a political tool. He would get people from Washington out to Texas, and when he wanted something from them, he would soften them up. He would take them on a horseback ride around the ranch. Then he'd bring them back and he'd give them some of Zephyr's wonderful Pedernales chili, and maybe some beer, followed by a little whiskey. And then he'd move in for the kill. And he'd say, "Now, boy, I want you to do me a favor." And it was very hard to resist LBJ in those moments. So much like Hercules, Zephyr Wright was crucial to the Johnson family and to his presidency. So when he didn't respond to her refusing to go to Texas, she didn't quite know what to make of that. But then years later, when he was president, he signed the Civil Rights Act, and he handed the pen to her, and she said, "You, of all people, deserve this pen." And it was a gracious note.
Very nice moment.
And you have to believe, reading between the lines, that she helped to turn his mind in favor of civil rights.
Michelle Obama planted a White House kitchen garden. Children came and helped plant and harvest, and it was wildly successful, even though big agriculture saw it as a threat. I'm not sure why, but years later, when Trump came into power, he wanted to raise the garden. And what happened when he...
He wanted to turn it into a putting green. Ha ha. Well, the Obamas suspected that something like that was going to happen. And so before they left the White House, they did two things. First, they physically reinforced the garden by adding stone and concrete and big wood and things, so that to take it apart would have been very expensive. So that was kind of brilliant. They reinforced it. And the second thing they did is they arranged for the Burpee Seed Company to underwrite the maintenance of the garden at a tune of $1 million a year. So it wouldn't cost the taxpayers anything. So there was no real legitimate reason for Trump to remove the garden. And so Trump didn't remove the garden, and sure enough, Melania would pose for publicity pictures with children in the garden, much like Michelle had done, even though she was wearing a designer shirt that was worth something like $5,000 when she was out there, pulling up the radishes and cutting the lettuces. So it became a photo op for the Trumps as well.
One last question. Not last, next to the last question about Trump, who had a bottomless cup of Diet Coke and overcooked steaks covered with ketchup, and really liked being called the fast food president. Tell us about what happened when the Clemson University Tigers won the 2019 NCAA football championship and came to the House to be feted.
Yeah, well,
by the fast food president.
Exactly, the fast food president. Well, I think that Trump was very shrewd the way he used fast food. When he was tweeting out pictures of taco bowls and Pizza Hut and McBurgers, he was essentially saying to his audience, you like this food, I like this food, vote for me. And it turns out that there's a real psychological thing that happens. When you see somebody wearing a similar piece of clothing to you, you might think, oh, that's a nice shirt, but you don't think more about it. But when you see somebody eating something that you like to eat, it goes into our prehistoric brain and it says, we're from the same tribe, we eat the same food, therefore I trust this person. It was the same thing that Ronald Reagan did with his jelly beans. It was a way of communicating with their base, it was sort of a subverbal way. And so when the Clemson Tigers won the football championship, he invited them, Donald Trump invited them to the White House for a burger banquet, which was sort of like a state dinner for this football team, in the state dining room, under the portrait of Lincoln, with beautiful candles lit and silver platters that happened to be filled with cold burgers, wilting fries, old pizza, plastic pods of salad, plastic containers of ketchup. And it was kind of brilliant because it affronted every traditionalist on all sides of the spectrum, of the political spectrum. And it immediately, the images of that dinner went around the world in 10 seconds and became defining images of his White House. And it was part of his whole approach, which was to say, I'm not like the Washington insiders. I'm a blue-collar billionaire. And he didn't even have to say it, but the message was clear that he was going to upset the apple cart and have fast food in the White House. And it greatly upset people. In fact, there are still people today, Republicans indeed, who are still mad about that.
Mm-hmm.
So.
So in a debate, Trump accused Biden of using performance-enhancing drugs. And what was Biden's response?
Ice cream is my performance-enhancing drug, he said.
Okay, we're going to do a lightning round.
Sure.
One of the fun things about reading your book is learning about everyone's favorite foods. So I'm going to name a president and give me a food.
Okay.
George W. Bush.
Nachos.
Okay. Clinton.
Well, originally burgers, but then he got off the burgers and he became a vegetarian. So you'd have to say hummus and carrots, maybe.
Okay. Lincoln.
Lincoln was from the frontier. He loved cornbread, he loved raw honey, apples, things that were very basic.
Nixon.
Nixon. Well, every day for lunch, Richard Nixon would have a little dollop of cottage cheese. This was part of the California diet. Sometimes he'd dress it up with some ketchup, or he'd put it on a pineapple ring. I have insert colored photographs in the middle of the book, and you'll see a photograph of his last lunch, which was a dollop of cottage cheese on a pineapple ring and a glass of milk. And it's just so weird.
Ford.
Well, Ford had what he called Michigan gourmet, so he liked, big hearty roasts and cabbage and things like that.
LBJ.
LBJ, ribs.
Jimmy Carter.
Grits.
Reagan.
Jelly beans. Steak.
George H.W. Bush.
Well, definitely not broccoli. George H.W., he had pretty plain taste. He would sometimes have cereal for dinner, being a Yankee, but he liked a good steak.
FDR.
Bison tongue.
William Taft.
Roasted possum.
Eisenhower.
Ike loved a hearty steak, and as I mentioned, I have the recipe in the book. He would get a grill going up on the White House roof, and he would remove the grill part, and he'd get these coals burnt down so they were glowing. He put the steak right in the coals, which gives it a nice sear, and then you flip it over and you sear it again, and that leaves a nice pink interior and a seared exterior, and it's really delicious. And you don't really have to worry about the ash, you just brush it off, and it's really good, and it's fun to do.
Okay. Finally, you've peeked into the lives of a lot of presidents. If you could have one invitation to a single presidential dinner, past or present, whose White House do you want to dine at?
Well, I would pick a meal not at the White House that I opened the book with, which was a meal hosted by Thomas Jefferson for James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who were warring over two, today we might consider them obscure issues, which were so important at the time that they threatened to rip the country apart. The first was, how do we pay our Revolutionary War debts, and could the federal government tax the people? Which was essentially about how do we create a financial system for the country. And the second was, where would a federal city be built? At the time, Washington was the president. He'd only been in office for a year, so our democracy was kind of an idea more than a fact. They were still figuring things out. The temporary capital was New York City. And so Jefferson had these two guys who couldn't even talk to each other. Their debate was so furious. Over to his house on Maiden Lane, which is in today's Greenwich Village in New York. And they had a secret dinner together, cooked by James Hemings. It was this wonderful meal. It began with a Jeffersonian salad with a wine jelly dressing, followed by capon, which was stuffed with chestnuts, followed by a braised beef dish. And all of this was accompanied by Jefferson's wonderful wine that he'd imported from France. Dessert was something that Americans had never heard of before, which was cold vanilla ice cream wrapped in a warm puff pastry. And this was something he'd brought back from Paris. And Jefferson reserved this for very special evenings, and James Hemings was his pièce de résistance, and they served that with champagne. And sure enough, over the course of the meal, the two enemies began to relax, and they actually began to talk to each other like normal human beings, and they talked about architecture and what was happening in France, but not about these tension points between them. And Jefferson was very good at orchestrating these events. Finally, at the end of the meal, he gave them snifters of brandy to kind of put them over the top. And shortly thereafter, they brokered an agreement. Madison was allowed to build a federal capital in a nominally southern site, which is today's Washington, D.C., and Hamilton was allowed to impose taxes by the federal government to pay for Revolutionary War debts and construct a financial system. And this became known as the dinner table bargain. And it has resonance today. We're still fighting over taxes and the role of the federal government. Some people still hate Washington as the federal capital. And if any of you have seen Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton musical, you'll know the song "The Room Where It Happened" is an ode to this dinner, the dinner table bargain. And it's rapped by a jealous Aaron Burr, who was not invited to the dinner. And he's wondering what happened in the back room and how did the sausage get made in the back room. And it's a wonderful song. And so that meal was so important that it essentially saved the Republic, this one dinner where they managed to broker peace over food. And so I love it because not only was this a fabulous dinner with incredible wines, the personalities involved were amazing, and I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that.
And can you tell us briefly about the White House dinner that you threw in Washington?
Sure. Well, so writing this book, I very much wanted to go to a state dinner myself. Part of this book was partly inspired by my great aunt, Julia Child, who attended 2 state dinners and made television documentaries about them. The first was in '67 when LBJ hosted Prime Minister Sato from Japan, and Tony Bennett was the performer. Henry Holler was the chef. He made this remarkable lobster dinner. The second was 9 years later, 1976, when Gerald Ford was president, and he hosted Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip for the bicentennial. This was obviously a huge event. They built a white tent over the Rose Garden. Everything was meticulously choreographed. Right before the dinner was supposed to start, a terrible rainstorm came in off the Potomac, knocked down the TV cameras, soaked Julia and all the other guests, created a big puddle. They had to regroup. The dinner went on, but it remained a little damp. Bob Hope's jokes were a little flat. When the Queen was dancing with the President, the Marine Band inadvertently struck up "The Lady is a Tramp." And for me, the kicker was that the entertainment that night was the Captain and Tennille warbling about muskrat love, which Julia deemed rather unqueenly. But at the end of the day, she said in her voiceover that it was such a great event to attend. It was the bicentennial, it was the Queen and the President, and she was very glad that she was there. And that just sort of shows you about the importance of the state dinners. So I was inspired by this. I got interested in state dinners, and this is part of the reason that the book took off. And I was appealing to the Trump administration to invite me to a state dinner. They only had 2. The first was for Macron, and the second was for the Prime Minister of Australia. And they did not invite me. And so I decided that the next best thing was to host my own state dinner. And so by hook and by crook, I was able to get a former White House chef, a guy named John Mueller, to cook a presidential meal. These were all dishes that had been served at the White House that he had personally cooked for presidents. And each one has a story behind it. And I invited 9 guests, and the chef and myself, to what I called my White House dinner. And they included people who worked at the White House or had covered it for the Washington Post or were food historians or journalists like Corby Kummer. And we had this presidential meal at a historical mansion that's right around the corner from the White House, where various presidents had lived, including the Lincolns for a while. So we began with some canapes and then a mushroom soup, a wild mushroom soup, which was an homage to Washington and his troops starving at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777, where they were foraging mushrooms. Then we had a delicious salmon, which was an homage to the presidential salmon, and I told them the Herbert Hoover story of the headless salmon. And then we moved on to a salad with a wedge of Amish cheese, and the salad was an homage to Thomas Jefferson and his famous gardens at Monticello. And then we finished with a chocolate and raspberry bomb, just because every president and every one of my guests loved chocolate, and so why not? But also, chocolate was part of the slave trade, and so there was a little backstory to that. And it was a fabulous evening, and we spent a lot of time talking about what it's like to be invited to a state dinner, to actually experience it. And the answer is kind of fascinating. People become overwhelmed when they go into the into the White House because it's this image of America that they've all seen a million times. But many of them haven't been there. And you walk in there, and I experienced this myself when I went and visited in 2016. And there's something about being in those halls and seeing the portraits of the presidents and the busts that brings history alive in a way that a photograph can't really. And you're experiencing this. And people become overwhelmed, and some people break into tears. Other people have apparently passed out. They get so caught up in this. And people get excited at the dinner, and they kind of forget where they are. They often won't let go of the president's hand when they're shaking it, or they'll steal things like a spoon. And the White House curator, Betty Monkman, told a funny story. She says, the waiters are all trained. When they see a missing spoon, they'll say to the guest, it seems probably the spoon fell on the floor. I'm going to take the dishes away, and I'll be back in a minute, and we'll see if we can find it. And the waiter disappears, whereupon the guest takes the purloined item out of her purse and puts it on the floor. And they say, oh, there it is. But they also say that people are so busy looking at each other that they kind of forget what they're eating and who they're sitting next to and what they're talking about. So the tradition at the end of a state dinner is that everybody gets a menu, a printed menu, which is often quite beautiful, and you're at a round table, and everybody around the table signs each other's menus, so that the next day you can say, oh, that's what I ate, and that's who I was sitting next to. And so I actually have a photograph of one of those in the book. And so we did that night of my White House dinner. We all signed the menus. And it was just a really interesting evening and kind of a wonderful thing, unbeknownst to us. So this was on President's Day of 2020, which turned out to be the day, unbeknownst to us, when the second American died of COVID. We were so lucky because our dinner could have turned into a super spreader event, but we had no idea.
Or not occurred.
Or not occurred. And, luckily I'd had that dinner by that point because COVID then shut everything down. Everything at the White House stopped. All the presidential museums closed. Places like the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress closed. So I was in the middle of reporting this book. And I love to go out and report and to see these places because it really does bring things alive. And I couldn't do that. So I was very lucky because by that point I had been working on the book for 2 years, and I had enough sources that they were able to send me things. It wasn't quite the same, but it was a stroke of luck that we got that done then.
So I think we have questions now. Okay, good.
Hi. There's a story about a woman at a dinner at the White House with Calvin Coolidge. And she said, Mr. Coolidge, I have a bet that I can get you to say more than 3 words. And he said, you lose, and didn't say another word through the entire dinner. Now, this guy's kind of like weird, to say the least. Could you fill in some of his strange apparitions or whatever he was doing? I mean, he's kind of like a spooky guy, It's like he never existed. But
he was a great character, actually, Calvin Coolidge. To set the scene, you have to understand that his predecessor was Warren G. Harding, who was the polar opposite of Coolidge. Harding did not want to be president, should not have been president, but his political cronies put him in office. He ended up having all sorts of affairs, and he had what he called the poker cabinet, where they would confiscate the public's alcohol and then drink it up in the private quarters of the White House while playing poker and smoking cigars and eating bratwurst and sauerkraut. And so that was his White House. He ended up dying, allegedly from some food poisoning, but probably more because he had a quack doctor who was giving him all sorts of stuff. And so his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, inherited the office. Now, Coolidge was a Vermonter. He was a real Yankee farmer. He grew up in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, which is a great place to visit. I highly recommend it. It's this beautiful little hamlet in a valley between two mountains. And his family kind of ran the town, and they made what's called Plymouth cheese there, which is like a cheddar. And they still make it there. And it's quite good. And he was a taciturn Yankee, and he had very particular tastes. So when he came to the White House, he liked to grind his own oatmeal. He used special oats. He had a chicken coop out back in the White House, and his chicken tasted like mint. And they discovered that was because they had put the chickens on top of Teddy Roosevelt's former mint patch, which he had grown for his mint juleps. And Coolidge, he was quirky. He would, his wife, Grace, was actually a wonderful cook. She liked to cook. She would bake an apple pie in the White House kitchen, and he would have a bite of it, and he would say, well, you could pave a road with that crust, which most wives would take great offense at, but Grace was well named. She gracefully just took it in stride. She was famous because she had a pet raccoon who had been sent to them to eat, and she instead adopted the raccoon and named her Rebecca, and Rebecca lived in a tree outside of the White House. And Coolidge was quirky, and he was one of the very few presidents who ultimately decided he only wanted to be there for one term, and he resigned and died shortly after. But he was famous at the White House for penny pinching on food, and he would host meetings of the Congress, breakfast meetings, and everybody would have their questions, and he would speak in very few words, eat his meal, and then abruptly get up and leave. And they would all look at each other and saying, what the heck was going on? And it turned out if he'd had one of these meetings, he could write it off to the government. He didn't have to pay for it. So this was the kind of guy he was. Yes, he was quirky, indeed.
Yes.
This will probably land as flat as Bob Hope's humor, but did Jefferson create the Brandy Alexander Hamilton?
Did he? Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know.
I told you.
Yeah.
A question. I believe that Nancy Reagan tried to recreate the same style of Jackie Kennedy, Hollywood on the Potomac. Did she succeed or fail?
She came close. She denied trying to emulate Jackie, but she clearly did, including wearing similar outfits and a pillbox hat that Jackie was so famous for, and actually hired Letitia Baldridge, who was Jackie's social secretary, to teach her the ways of Washington and to introduce her to people on both sides of the aisle, which was actually a smart idea. Because when they first arrived in Washington, the Reagans didn't know many people, especially Democrats. And so through Baldridge and a few other people, they were introduced to people like Kay Graham, who was the publisher of the Washington Post and a staunch Democrat. And she also was introduced to sort of the old line Republicans who weren't so in favor of these West Coasters. And she immediately began hosting a series of dinners, as Jackie had done, which were pretty good, but they weren't quite up to the Kennedy level, which was sort of spectacular and Jefferson-esque, except for one, or maybe two. There were two. I would say one was the state dinner for Gorbachev. Once they signed the START II treaty, which eliminated the medium-range nuclear weapons in Europe right next to Russia, and it was essentially the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And Gorbachev came and Raisa came over, and there was this amazing state dinner, which was a very emotional moment, as I write about in the book. But the one that really caught people's attention and was Kennedy-esque was the famous state dinner for Prince Charles and Lady Diana, where Jackie had invited a special guest that nobody was really aware of except for the President and First Lady. There was a tall figure standing in the shadows as this state dinner happened, and then people were dancing. And then Reagan was dancing with Lady Di, and suddenly this figure comes out of the shadows, and it's John Travolta. And he cuts in on the president, and he starts dancing with Lady Di. And she had been a huge fan of his. And they danced together, and it was kind of this magical evening that was photographed, and like Trump's burgers, it became a defining image of their administration. And so I think that night, Nancy achieved Jackie Kennedy level success.
Have the
Complete-
Bidens done
complete-
any state dinners? I'm sorry.
The Bidens have done one state dinner for Macron recently. They are going to be doing their second for the president of South Korea coming up, and then they have Narendra Modi of India lined up without a date yet. And I'm still trying to get invited to one, so
Thank you very much.
root for me.
Mrs. Reagan had the surprise guest, like Jackie did.
That's right, exactly.
Yes.
Hi, so I am the staff representative for our online attendees. So I have two questions for you from them. The menus at the state dinners were important, but so were the centerpieces provided by the White House florists. Would you explain why they were necessary and how they added to the meal and atmosphere? And the second question is what president that you cover in your book had the most varied or adventurous menus?
That's a tough one. Well, I'll answer the second question first. So the most varied menus, you could look at lots of different people who, you look at Obama, for example. People know that he was raised in Hawaii, but they don't know that he was also spent formative years in Jakarta in Indonesia. And he, I think, had the most global palate of anybody by the time he came into the White House, with the possible exception of Herbert Hoover. But actually, the most varied, I would say, might be, and you'll be surprised to hear this, Richard Nixon, Mr. Cottage Cheese. And I say this because when he wasn't eating cottage cheese, he would like to go to Trader Vic's, if you guys remember the Trader Vic's, which was this kind of ersatz, somewhat Asian American place where they had very strong drinks. But then, more famously, in 1972, he went to China, and he opened up China, so-called, to the West. And he met with Mao, and he had an amazing banquet with Zhou Enlai. And this was 72. Barbara Walters was covering the event, and she was very excited about this. It was the first time that television cameras were allowed to a state visit, and he had been burned by Kennedy in their debates, their televised debates, so he understood the optics of this moment. And so he, before he went, he studied up on Chinese food, which involved a lot of spices and ingredients that we don't use, and that somebody who eats cottage cheese for lunch every day would probably never go near. He also trained himself how to use chopsticks because he understood that if the images of him using chopsticks succeeded, that would make him look presidential. And he practiced for weeks on this, and he practiced picking up cashews and marbles and all sorts of things. And sure enough, when the images of the president picking up a chicken gizzard with his chopsticks appeared on American televisions, Barbara Walters practically exploded, and she said, "The president is using chopsticks and he's eating Chinese food." And this was considered a remarkable event, and he was running his re-election campaign, and he understood, and he was right, that the images of him eating a chicken gizzard with his chopsticks was almost as powerful as the actual diplomacy that was ongoing. The added benefit of this was it set off a whole second wave of Chinese restaurants across the country here, because suddenly Chinese was in. The first one happened during the gold rush, but the second one happened after Nixon, and it led to the explosion of Chinese things. So I just think the variety from cottage cheese every day to this exotic Chinese food, that's a pretty good spectrum. As for the flower arrangements, well, flowers are beautiful and decorative. They can be kind of distractors for people. Flowers represent the First Lady to a certain extent. As I mentioned, there used to be these giant bouquets which would block people's view of each other. sometimes intentionally. U.S. Grant, who was kind of a rough and ready general before he became president, didn't really like going to big dinner parties. He liked to hang out with his cronies and smoke cigars, and didn't like being the center of attention. And he would sometimes hide behind the flowers so he didn't have to talk to somebody he didn't want to talk to. But Jackie Kennedy very astutely created these lower, beautiful bouquets. And there's a whole office at the White House dedicated to the flowers. There's also a whole calligraphy office where they create the menus for not only these state dinners, but for all the other dinners and meals that go on at the White House almost every day.
Yes.
Yes. Back in 2019, Roland Mesnier, the White House pastry chef, was here. And one of the things that they asked him is, what excited your staff the most? What guest excited your staff the most? And he said, Princess Diana.
Yeah.
And in your research, what guests have excited the White House chefs the most?
Well, every era has their stars. The first state dinner was hosted by U.S. Grant. The first state dinner for a foreign dignitary, which is how we think of state dinners now. Previously, had been a state dinner was for a cabinet member or a congressional leader. But in 1874, Grant had not the King of England or the Tsar of Russia. He invited King Kalakaua of the Sandwich Islands, now known as Hawaii, over. And the backdrop to this was that Kalakaua was the king of a slowly degrading archipelago of islands in Hawaii. And they had enormous sugar plantations, but they couldn't sell too much in the States because we had very high tariffs on the sugar. So he came to Washington to ask Grant to lower the tariffs because he needed some income to keep his kingdom going. And Grant was a pretty shrewd strategician. He was good at strategy. And he said, okay, I'll lower the tariffs, but in return, you must open up Pearl Harbor as a naval base for the U.S. And this concerned the islanders, who felt that this could be the beginning of the end of their kingdom, and they were proven correct ultimately. But when Kalakaua came to Washington, he was given this big parade and the first state dinner, which really set the template for modern state dinners. And the Grants had a chef named Valentino Mela, who was Sicilian. And he was known as the professor because he was a real student of culinary history, and he was also a wonderful chef. And the menu for that dinner has been lost, but we can infer from his other menus that he cooked something like 32 dishes, many of which were paired with delicious wines. And Kalakaua was a big roly-poly guy who loved to eat, but he showed up with two food tasters who stood sort of stone-faced on either side of him and tasted the food to make sure he wasn't being poisoned. So this sort of set the pattern for the state dinners. More recently, I would say a personage that excited the kitchen the most would have been Nelson Mandela, who came during the Clinton years as a guest. The Clintons brought a black chef who was one of the few black chefs in America who was trained in France and was a high-level cook at the Odeon in New York, which is a famous restaurant, and then later at Tavern on the Green. And his name is escaping me right now, which is Patrick Clark. Thank you. Patrick Clark, who is this wonderful cook and very inventive. And they invited him to cook that night for Mandela. And he said, sure, I'll do that. And then the Clintons thought better of it, and they invited Patrick Clark and his wife as guests. And Clark's sous chef made a dish, which is a halibut dish, with certain spices that are popular in South Africa as a kind of a tribute to Mandela. And this dinner was another one that I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall at. It was just remarkable. one of the funny side stories is that everybody in Washington and practically everybody in America wanted to be at that dinner. And so the gamesmanship to get invitations to that were kind of notorious. But it was a very successful dinner. And Patrick Clark, unfortunately, died young not that long after it. So it was great that he was able to be there.
Mm-hmm. And you write that the kitchen for the Mandela dinner, the people who worked in the kitchen were so moved to be able to do that.
A lot of the kitchen staff are black, and they were very moved to be part of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm curious a little bit about sense of scale in a number of ways. You're trying to get an invite. How many people are you competing with to get an invite? So I'm curious, how many people are invited? Has that changed over time? And you dropped a number, which could be, X or 2X in terms of how much was spent. And I'm wondering if that changed over time. And I'm also wondering, sense of scale, US versus international dinners. Like, I remember walking through Buckingham Palace where they were measuring where every spoon and fork would go. So can you tell us a little bit about the numbers?
Sure. Good question. In terms of cost, it depends on the guest of honor and the kind of the circumstances. So a Mandela dinner probably cost close to $1 million because they needed security. They had Whitney Houston was singing that night. She alone would charge a big fee. It was, the food was remarkable. They brought Patrick Clark and his whole team in from New York. And in terms of the guests, similarly, it was a really big deal, as I mentioned. But there were many smaller dinners where the cost would be much less. The guest competition was less fierce. And a normal state dinner is about 120 people. The Clintons were notorious for trying to double that. They never quite doubled it, but they did have enormous dinners, and they would put people, overflow crew, not only in the state dining room, but in the blue room and the red room sometimes. As far as I know, the biggest state dinner came during a celebration of the Camp David Accords, which I write about in the Jimmy Carter chapter. Jimmy Carter brought Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat up to Camp David and brokered a peace between Egypt and Israel, which was considered impossible, and he did it. And part of the way he did that was he got the delegates, or I should say Rosalind got the delegates, who were not the leaders, but their staff, to commingle over food. There was a lot of tension there. They didn't want to, neither side would give an inch. And so Rosalind had the idea of putting different kinds of foods in different rooms and getting the staff to go from room to room, following the breadcrumbs, as it were, or the cookie crumbs. Sure enough, as they mingled over food, the staff began to warm up to each other. And this is the part of the power of food. And they were able to ultimately broker this remarkable peace. And then there was a state dinner on the White House lawn that was enormous, and I forget the number, but it was well over 200 people under tents. And that was the biggest so far. So in terms of scale, that was the biggest. And in terms of production values, a la Buckingham Palace, when a president goes abroad, that's a really big deal. And so I mentioned the Nixon in China dinner, for example. Certainly Buckingham Palace is a fantastic stage set. And I don't know what the costs are, but the venue is remarkable. And if you look at the photographs, you can find them online. It's an amazing event. And so scale is interesting because it kind of tells you about the import of the guest and the import of the subject under negotiation.
And if you're sitting in a room, in a satellite room, it certainly tells you the importance of you as the guest.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes.
I have another question from one of our online guests. Who coordinated the political agenda with the guests and messaging through cuisine?
Well, a state dinner is highly choreographed, and it involves a lot of people. It's I don't think there's ever been a kind of a food fail during a state dinner, but there have been other kinds of fails. I mentioned Gerald Ford's bicentennial, which was kind of ham-handed and didn't go well. But the coordination begins months before a state dinner, and it's usually driven by the State Department. We talk to the ambassador. So when Macron came, the State Department was talking to the French embassy here, and in Paris, the French were speaking to the American diplomats and transmitting things about what Macron likes to eat or not eat. I remember Julia Child talking about when Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip came over, and the chef Henry Holler saying that the Queen didn't like raw fish, sushi, but Prince Philip was an old Navy man. He'd eat anything. Did not have discerning taste. So there's sort of this fine tuning that happens. They propose various menus and they kind of go back and forth, and so ultimately they come up with a menu that is representative of the best of American ingredients and technique, and has some symbolism, but also nods to the guest. So, for example, in the Mandela halibut had the spices that came from South Africa. When Gorbachev came, Reagan served wine from the Russian River Valley, where a lot of Russians had emigrated to and grown wine. So there's usually a nod, and sometimes it's through the wine, sometimes it's through the dessert. When Roland Mesnier would make these remarkable desserts, so for the Queen of England, he made a blown sugar carriage with horses, which was apparently a kind of an amazing work of art. So the pastry chef plays an important role for those kinds of deals, and they're real productions. They're quite amazing. I would love to go to one of those dinners.
Before we wrap up, there's a little goodie for you all to take that in the lobby, and Alex is going to sign books, I believe. How are we going to get you to a state dinner? What are you?
I'm working on it.
Do you have a lobbyist? I mean, who do you call?
I know people. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm talking to people.
Okay. Okay.
We'll see what happens.
Okay, well, let us know how that goes.
For sure.
Yes.
I'll come back and tell you all about it.
Okay, and thank you very much for...
Thank you all.
Very, very
Thanks,
nice
Sheryl.
evening.
Yeah, it was fun.
Nice to... Yeah.